The late afternoon sun, usually a welcome guest in Elias Vance's garden, felt like an interrogator's lamp. It cast long, distorted shadows that writhed on the manicured lawn, a lawn he himself had spent countless hours tending. He stood in the cool shade of the old oak tree at the edge of his property, his travel bag still slung over one shoulder. He had come home 2 days early from his trip to Chicago, a trip his wife, Isabel, had called another one of his pointless little consultations for projects that go nowhere. But there on the stone patio he had designed and laid with his own hands, his wife was getting married. Isabel was radiant in a cascade of white lace and silk, a vision of bridal perfection. She was smiling, a brilliant, ecstatic smile he hadn't seen directed at him in years. Her hand, the one that still wore his wedding band beneath a delicate glove, was clasped in the hand of another man, Julian Croft. A man of shimmering surfaces and hollow depths, whose expensive suits and confident pronouncements had lately become the gold standard against which Elias was perpetually measured and found wanting. A small gathering of guests, many of whom Elias recognized as his own friends and neighbors, sat in pristine white chairs. At the front, officiating, was a man he'd never seen before, speaking of union, of fidelity, of a future built together. They all thought Elias Vance was a failure, a quiet, unassuming architect content with small renovations and unrealized dreams. They thought he was 300 miles away, chasing another mediocre contract. They didn't know that the pointless little consultation in Chicago was the final signature on the largest urban development project the city had seen in a century. And they certainly didn't know that within the hour, their carefully constructed world of status and illusion would be dismantled, brick by painful brick, by the very man they had so carelessly discarded. We've all felt the sting of being underestimated, haven't we? That quiet dismissal that says, "You are not enough." It's a universal pain. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today as we witness a story about the true nature of strength. And if you believe that patience and integrity are their own reward, but a little vindication doesn't hurt, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories that satisfy the soul. Now let us return to the garden, where a marriage is about to be interrupted by a husband. For a long moment, Elias simply watched. The scene before him was so surreal it felt like a play. The air was thick with the scent of roses and hypocrisy. He could see Isabel's mother, Eleanor, dabbing a tear from her eye with a silk handkerchief, her face a mask of proud contentment. Eleanor, who had once told him over a tense Sunday dinner, "Isabel needs a man who can build an empire, Elias, not just sketch blueprints for other people's guest bathrooms." Elias had merely nodded, a gesture she took for acquiescence, for an admission of his own inadequacy. He didn't bother to explain that the guest bathroom was part of a historic preservation project that had won him a national award, an award he never mentioned because he knew it wouldn't be the kind of trophy they valued. The memory was sharp, painful. It had been 6 months ago. They were hosting a dinner party, something Isabel insisted upon to keep up appearances. The guests were a mix of her social circle and his few professional acquaintances. Julian Croft had been there, a recent addition to their lives, brought in by Isabel as a potential client for Elias. Julian had spent the evening talking loudly about market shares and leveraged buyouts, his voice booming with the unearned confidence of a man who mistakes cash flow for character. At one point, Julian had turned to Elias, a smirk playing on his lips. "So, Elias," he'd said, his tone dripping with condescension, "Isabel tells me you're an architect. Anything I might have seen?" Before Elias could answer, Eleanor had chimed in, her laugh like the tinkle of ice in an empty glass. "Oh, Elias is very boutique," she'd said, the word a silken insult. "He's more focused on the artistic integrity of the work, aren't you, dear? Not so much the scale." Isabel had placed a hand on Julian's arm, a gesture of alignment. "My husband is a purist," she'd said, and the way she said, "my husband," made it sound like a liability. He believes a building should have a soul. It's a very romantic notion. The implication was clear. Romantic notions don't pay for couture gowns and European vacations. Elias had felt the familiar heat of humiliation creep up his neck. He remembered looking down at his plate, at the intricate dance of sauce and garnish, and feeling a profound sense of dislocation. He was in his own home, at his own table, yet he was an outsider. He reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the cool, smooth barrel of his Lamy 2000 fountain pen. It was a simple, elegant tool, a Bauhaus classic. To them, it was just a pen. To him, it was the instrument with which he had sketched the initial, audacious designs for the Olympus project, a multi-billion-dollar tower that would not just scrape the sky, but redefine the city's relationship with it. In a leather-bound notebook in his briefcase upstairs were the foundational sketches, the load-bearing calculations, the first whispers of a new skyline. He had said nothing that night. He had simply taken a slow sip of water, met his wife's dismissive gaze, and offered a quiet, measured response. "I build things that are meant to last." Julian had laughed, a short, barking sound. "That's nice," he'd said. "I prefer to build things that make money, quickly." The table had chuckled along with him, and the conversation had moved on, leaving Elias in a pocket of polite, pitying silence. Now, standing under the oak tree, the memory fueled not anger, but a cold, clarifying calm. He saw Julian raise a glass of champagne. "To Isabel," Julian toasted, his voice carrying across the lawn. "A woman who knows her own worth and isn't afraid to claim it. And to new beginnings, free from the weight of the past." The guests cheered. Isabel beamed, her eyes shining. The weight of the past. That was him. He was the weight. A dead anchor on her glittering social ascent. He watched as she leaned in to kiss Julian, a deep, passionate kiss that was a performance for the crowd, a final disavowal. Elias adjusted the strap of his bag on his shoulder. It contained his laptop, a change of clothes, and a single, thick manila envelope. Inside that envelope was the culmination of 3 years of secret, relentless work. It contained the final incorporation papers for his firm, Vance Architectural Design, or VAD, the firm no one in his family knew he owned outright. It contained the signed contracts for the Olympus project, and it contained a meticulously compiled dossier on Julian Croft's precarious financial empire, a house of cards built on risky loans and inflated projections, all of which were dependent on him landing a partnership with a major developer for a landmark project. A project like Olympus. Elias had not planned for this. He had not orchestrated this collision of worlds. But when he had seen the charge for Evergreen Gardens Event Services on their joint credit card statement 2 days ago, a charge for $10,000, he had understood everything in a flash. He had called the venue, posing as a vendor, and confirmed the booking, the Croft Vance wedding. He had felt a moment of shattering pain, a deep, visceral grief for the woman he had once loved, the life he thought they were building. Then, that grief had cooled, hardened, and sharpened into a single, unwavering purpose. He did not book a frantic flight home. He did not make a tearful, angry phone call. He calmly finished his meetings in Chicago, securing the last piece of the puzzle. He had dinner with Alistair Finch, the legendary developer Julian so desperately courted, and they had shaken hands, not just as architect and client, but as partners. And then he had booked a seat on the first flight the next morning. He had chosen his moment. And the moment was now. He took a deep breath, the scent of cut grass and betrayal filling his lungs, and stepped out from the shadow of the oak tree into the unforgiving sunlight. The first person to see him was a neighbor, Mrs. Gable from 2 houses down. Her mouth fell open in a perfect O of shock. The canapé she was raising to her lips froze in midair. Her husband followed her gaze, his eyes widening. A ripple of confusion spread through the guests, a wave of murmurs and pointed fingers. The officiant, mid-sentence, faltered and stopped. The idyllic scene fractured. Isabel and Julian, wrapped in their bubble of triumph, were the last to notice. It was Eleanor, her face draining of all color, who finally alerted them. "Isabel," she whispered, her voice a strangled hiss. Isabel turned, her radiant smile faltering as she saw the direction of everyone's gaze. Her eyes found Elias. For a heartbeat there was only silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Elias saw a flicker of genuine, unscripted panic in his wife's eyes, quickly masked by a practiced veneer of annoyance. She disengaged her hand from Julian's, taking a half-step forward. "Elias," she said, her voice tight, artificially sweet. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be in Chicago." It was not a question, but an accusation. "You are ruining my perfect day." Julian Croft, ever the master of ceremonies, recovered first. He draped a proprietary arm around Isabel's shoulders, pulling her back to his side. He looked Elias up and down, taking in his travel-worn clothes, the simple bag over his shoulder. The look was one of pure disdain, the kind one gives to a vagrant who has wandered into a private club. "I believe this is a private event," Julian said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "You're trespassing." Elias stopped about 20 feet from the patio. He let his bag slide from his shoulder to the grass with a soft thud. He met Julian's gaze, then looked at Isabel, at the wedding dress she had bought with his money, in the garden of the home he paid for. "My home," Elias said, his voice quiet, yet it carried across the silent lawn with unnerving clarity. "My garden. My wife." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I believe it is you who is trespassing, Julian." This was the moment he had dreaded, and, in a dark corner of his mind, rehearsed. The confrontation, the ugly public unraveling. He thought back to another argument just a month ago. He had come home, excited about a breakthrough in the structural engineering for the Olympus project, a problem he'd been wrestling with for weeks. He had tried to share his excitement with Isabel. "I think I've solved it," he'd told her, spreading a preliminary sketch on the kitchen island. "The cantilevered observation deck. It's going to be magnificent." She had glanced at the drawing, a complex web of lines and numbers, with utter disinterest. "That's nice, dear," she'd said, scrolling through her phone. "Julian closed a deal on a new condo development today. He's taking me to celebrate at CL Blue tonight." CL Blue, the city's most exclusive restaurant, a place he knew she wanted to go, a place he could have easily afforded, but hadn't taken her because he was working 18-hour days to build their future. "This is important, Izzy," he had pleaded, a note of desperation in his voice. "This is the big one, the one I've been working toward our whole lives." She had finally looked up from her phone, her eyes cold. "Elias, I am tired of hearing about the big one. For 10 years, it's always been the next project, the next sketch. Julian doesn't just sketch things, Elias. He builds things. He makes things happen. He has vision. He has ambition." She had gestured around their beautiful, minimalist home, a home he had designed to be their sanctuary. "We live a nice life, a comfortable life, but it's a small life, Elias. And I am done with living a small life." Each word had been a carefully aimed dart. Vision, ambition, small. He had looked at the woman he loved, and for the first time he had seen a stranger. Someone who looked at his life's passion and saw only its monetary equivalent and found it lacking. He had carefully rolled up the sketch, the blueprint for a legacy, and slid it back into its tube. He hadn't said a word. The silence in the kitchen that night had been louder than any shouting match. It was the sound of a chasm opening between them. Now in the garden, that chasm was a canyon. Julian puffed out his chest, taking another step forward, positioning himself as Isabel's defender. "Look, pal," he began, dropping the pretense of civility. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you need to leave. Now. Isabel has made her choice. She's with me, We're getting married." "Are you?" Elias asked, his tone one of genuine curiosity. He looked past Julian, his eyes finding Isabel's again. She refused to meet his gaze, staring at a spot on the lawn somewhere to his left. He saw the shame and the defiance warring on her face. "A marriage is a legal contract, Isabel. You know that. We are still married. Did you forget that part?" A nervous murmur went through the guests. This was no longer just an awkward interruption. It was a legal and moral crisis playing out on the grass. The officiant was slowly backing away, his face pale. Eleanor, seeing her daughter's perfect day and her own social ascension crumbling, finally found her voice. She strode forward, her expression thunderous. "Elias Vance, you have some nerve to show up here and create a scene after everything Isabel has been through, holding this family together while you chase your little hobbies." "Hobbies?" Elias repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from above. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant ache, but it was overlaid with an almost preternatural calm. He knew all the pieces on the board. They only saw their own. "Yes, hobbies," Eleanor spat. "Your little drawings and your dusty books. Julian is a man of action, a provider. He can give my daughter the life she deserves, a life you were never capable of providing." "The life she deserves," Elias echoed softly. He finally bent down and unzipped his bag. The guests leaned forward, curious. Was it a weapon? A desperate plea? He reached inside and pulled out the thick manila envelope. He didn't open it. He simply held it in his hand, his fingers resting on the smooth paper. It was his symbolic object, not a pen this time, but the finished product, the proof. He had spent the last 2 days not in a whirlwind of anger, but in methodical preparation. After he'd confirmed the wedding, he hadn't slept. He had gone to his office, the sleek, downtown headquarters of VAD that Isabel thought was the firm of a friend he sometimes freelanced for, and he had worked. He'd had his legal team draft the initial divorce filings. He'd had his financial analyst update the report on Julian Croft's portfolio, cross-referencing it with the latest market data. He knew, for instance, that Julian had leveraged his entire company on the hope of securing a lucrative commercial leasing contract within the Olympus project. A contract Julian had been boasting about for weeks, claiming it was all but signed. Elias had orchestrated his arrival with the precision of an architect designing a load-bearing wall. He knew he had to be the calm center of the storm he was about to unleash. Any shouting, any pleading on his part would make him look weak, pathetic, the wronged husband. He had to be something else entirely. He had to be the arbiter of reality. He held the envelope and looked at the crowd. "I was in Chicago," he said, his voice level and clear, "finalizing a deal. It was a very important deal, one I've been working on for 3 years. It's funny, Isabel, you always said I lacked ambition." Isabel flinched as if struck. Julian, however, just sneered. "A deal? For what? A new patio for some suburban dentist? Don't be ridiculous, you're embarrassing yourself. Security," he barked, looking around for non-existent guards. "Someone get this man off the property." 2 of Julian's groomsmen, bulky men in ill-fitting tuxedos, started to move forward hesitantly. Elias held up a hand, not in a plea but in a gesture of command. It was so unexpected, so authoritative, that the men actually stopped. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, his voice dropping slightly, gaining a new layer of gravitas. He then turned his full attention to Julian. The moment had come, the first quiet bomb. "Tell me, Julian," Elias said, the very picture of calm inquiry. "You're a man who prides himself on being connected, on knowing what's happening in the city. Have you heard of the Olympus project?" The name landed in the quiet garden like a thunderclap. Every person there who paid any attention to business or city news knew the name. The Olympus project was legendary, a myth in the making. a towering, eco-friendly skyscraper that promised to be the new crown jewel of the city's skyline, complete with luxury residences, a five-star hotel, and a revolutionary public sky garden. It was the talk of the town, a symbol of the future. Julian's sneer faltered for the first time. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Of course he knew the project. His entire future depended on it. "What does that have to do with you?" he asked, a note of caution entering his voice. "I'm just curious," Elias continued, his tone conversational. "I know you've been putting in bids for the primary commercial leasing rights, telling everyone it's a sure thing. I imagine a contract like that would be the cornerstone of your new life together." He glanced at Isabel, who was now looking at Julian, a question in her eyes. "You must be in constant contact with the developer, Alistair Finch, and of course with the lead architect, the visionary behind the whole thing, the one they call VAD." Julian's face was now a mask of confusion and growing dread. VAD was the mystery man, the reclusive genius behind the project. No one knew his real identity. He was like a ghost, known only by his work and his initials. Julian had been trying for months to get a meeting, to find out who he was, to get an edge. "What are you talking about?" Julian demanded, his voice losing its smooth baritone, becoming strained. "I had dinner with Alistair Finch last night," Elias said simply, "in Chicago. We signed the final papers. He's a wonderful man, very excited about the project." Elias paused, letting the silence stretch, letting every guest hang on his next word. He looked directly at Julian, a hint of pity in his eyes. "He was asking about you, actually. He said you'd been persistent." The blood drained from Julian's face. He looked as if he'd been poleaxed. He understood the implication immediately. If Elias had been dining with Alistair Finch, the man who held Julian's fate in his hands, then Elias was not who he appeared to be. The entire power dynamic of the situation had been upended in a single sentence. Isabel stared, her mouth slightly agape, her mind struggling to connect the dots. Elias, her boring, unambitious husband, having dinner with the most powerful developer in the city? It was impossible. It made no sense. "Elias, what is this?" she pleaded, her voice a thin whisper. "Stop this. You're making a fool of yourself." "Am I?" Elias asked gently. He took a few steps forward, stopping at the edge of the patio. He was no longer on the defensive. He was in command. "For years I've been told I'm not enough, that I don't have vision, that I live a small life." He looked from Eleanor to Isabel. "I've been quiet. I've been patient. I believed my work would speak for itself eventually. I just didn't realize it would need to speak so loudly and all at once." He looked up at the sky, then back at the assembled crowd. "There's a car arriving," he said, as if predicting the weather. "A black town car. It should be here any moment." As if on cue, the sound of a luxury vehicle pulling into the driveway reached them. A car door opened and closed with a solid, expensive thud. A few seconds later, a man appeared, walking around the side of the house and onto the lawn. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, with a mane of silver hair and an air of absolute authority. It was Alistair Finch. The effect was instantaneous. Several of the guests gasped. Julian looked like he had seen a ghost. Alistair Finch was a titan, a figure you saw in the financial news, not at a suburban wedding. Finch's eyes scanned the bizarre scene, the bride, the groom, the stunned guests, and Elias standing calmly at the center of it all. He ignored everyone else and walked directly to Elias, his hand outstretched. "Elias," he said, his voice a warm, rich baritone that commanded respect. "I know you said you had a personal matter to attend to, but I wasn't expecting this." He gestured vaguely at the wedding tableau. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Alistair," Elias said, shaking his hand warmly. "You're right on time. Thank you for coming." Julian Croft was paralyzed. This was a nightmare. The man he had been desperately trying to meet for 6 months. The man who held his entire career in the palm of his hand was here, shaking hands with the pathetic failure he was trying to replace. He looked at Elias, then at Finch, his mind refusing to process the reality before him. Finch finally seemed to notice Julian, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Mr. Croft, isn't it?" he said, his tone turning frosty. "You're the one who's been flooding my office with calls. My assistant has become quite familiar with your name." Julian opened and closed his mouth like a fish, but no sound came out. Finch turned back to Elias, a smile returning to his face. "Well, let's not let this distract us. I just wanted to drop this off in person." He handed Elias a sleek, silver-plated USB drive. "The final renderings for the press release. They are magnificent, truly. Your vision, it's going to change this city." He clapped Elias on the shoulder. "The world is going to know your name very soon, Mr. Vance." He then looked at Elias's full name, and then at the initials everyone knew. Or should I say, VAD? Silence. A profound, deafening, world-altering silence. Isabel swayed on her feet, her hand flying to her mouth. VAD, Vance Architectural Design. Elias Vance. The connection was so simple, so obvious, yet so utterly inconceivable that it had been invisible. The reclusive genius, the visionary architect behind the most important project in the city, was not some mythical figure. He was her husband. The quiet, gentle man she had just tried to discard like a piece of old furniture. Eleanor stared, her face a grotesque canvas of shock and horror. The man she had mocked for his little hobbies was the creator of the Olympus project. The scale of her misjudgment was so vast, so catastrophic, it was beyond comprehension. Julian finally found his voice, a strangled, desperate croak. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not possible." He looked at Elias, his eyes pleading. You're VAD?" Elias met his gaze. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't need to say anything else. Alistair Finch's presence was the only confirmation needed. The truth was now in the open, undeniable and devastating. Finch, sensing he had walked into the middle of a personal drama of epic proportions, cleared his throat. "Elias, my apologies. I'll let you handle this." He gave Julian one last withering look. "Mr. Croft, I believe my office will be in touch with yours on Monday. We will no longer be requiring your services or considering your bids. For anything." He turned and walked back toward his car without a backward glance, the executioner having delivered his sentence. Julian staggered back as if he'd been physically struck. His entire empire, the one he had bragged about, the one he had used to lure Isabel, was built on the promise of his involvement in the Olympus project. Without it, his loans would be called in, his investors would flee. He was ruined. In the space of 30 seconds, he had gone from a titan of industry to a bankrupt fraud. He turned to Isabel, his face pale and sweating. "Isabel, this is a mistake, a misunderstanding." But Isabel wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Elias. She was seeing him for the first time. The quiet nights he spent sketching weren't hobbies, they were creation. The pointless trips weren't failures, they were negotiations. His patience wasn't weakness, it was strategy. The small life she had so scorned was the shadow cast by a towering, hidden success. She took a tentative step toward Elias, her white dress rustling on the grass. "Elias," she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know." Elias looked at her, and for the first time she saw not the gentle, forgiving man she had taken for granted, but a stranger whose eyes held a profound and unshakable resolve. The love she had counted on, the safety net she assumed would always be there, was gone. "No," he said, his voice soft but final. "You didn't." The immediate aftermath was a symphony of collapse. Julian Croft, his face ashen, began to babble, a torrent of desperate excuses and pleas directed at no one in particular. "This can't be happening. It's a joke. Elias, tell him. Tell him it's a mistake." He looked at the wedding guests, who were now staring at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They had come to celebrate his union with a beautiful, high-status woman, a union that cemented his position. Now they were witnesses to his complete and utter implosion. His power, derived entirely from the perception of wealth and influence, had evaporated in the harsh sunlight. Isabel stood frozen, a statue of white lace in shattered dreams. The man she was about to marry was a fraud. The man she had discarded was a giant. The very foundation of her world, her entire value system built on status, wealth, and appearance, had been pulverized. She looked at the diamond on Julian's finger, then at the simple gold band Elias had placed on hers 10 years ago. One was a hollow promise, the other a silent testament to a truth she had been blind to. Elias ignored Julian's frantic pleading. He had already dismissed him from his mind. His focus was now on Isabel, and on her mother, Eleanor, who was leaning against a pillar of the patio, her hand over her heart, looking as if she might faint. He walked onto the patio, the soles of his shoes making a soft, deliberate sound on the stone he had laid. He stopped in front of his wife. "You didn't know," he repeated, his voice devoid of anger, filled instead with a deep, resonant sadness. "That's what you have to say? After all this?" He gestured to the wedding arch, the flowers, the guests. "You built this entire lie, this whole charade, because you thought I was a failure. And now that you know the truth, your only defense is ignorance?" "Elias, I love you," she stammered, the words sounding hollow and desperate. Tears began to stream down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "I made a terrible mistake. I was foolish. I was listening to the wrong people." She shot a venomous glance at her mother. Eleanor flinched, but then her own survival instinct kicked in. She pushed herself off the pillar and rushed forward. "She's right, Elias. It was my fault. I pushed her. I put these ideas in her head. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. We can fix this. We can fix this, can't we?" Her voice was wheedling, sycophantic. The arrogant matriarch was gone, replaced by a desperate beggar. Elias listened to them, his expression unreadable. He let their pathetic, self-serving words fill the air. Then he began to speak, and it was not a conversation. It was a judgment. This was the list of grievances, the moral mirror he had earned the right to hold up. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice calm and methodical, each word a carefully placed stone. "So there are no more misunderstandings." He looked at Eleanor. "You told me I lacked ambition. On the night I won the National Preservation Award, you dismissed my work as a guest bathroom. My hobby, as you called it today, Eleanor, will generate more tax revenue for this city in its first year than your husband's entire company has in the last decade. My ambition was not to impress you at dinner parties. It was to build a legacy." He turned to Isabel. "You told me I lacked vision. You compared my sketches, my life's work, to Julian's condo developments. Isabel, the cantilevered observation deck you ignored? It's projected to become the single most visited tourist destination in the state. My vision wasn't for a new condo. It was for a new icon. You stood in our kitchen and told me I lived a small life." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the home, the garden, her dress. "This small life, this house, it's not in my name. It was purchased 2 years ago by a holding company, a subsidiary of Vance Architectural Design. I've been living in it as a company asset. The car you drive was leased by the firm. The vacations we took, the clothes you're wearing, the very wedding you've staged today, all of it was paid for by the profits from the small life you so desperately wanted to escape." A collective gasp went through the remaining guests. The humiliation was absolute. Not only had they misjudged his success, they had been unknowingly living off it while they mocked him. "You said Julian was a provider," Elias continued, his voice relentless. "His entire net worth is a fantasy, leveraged against a contract he was never going to get. The man you chose, the man of action, is bankrupt. He has nothing, less than nothing. He built his world on lies. I built mine on steel and glass and concrete. You chose the mirage over the mountain because the mirage was shinier." He took a step closer to her, his voice dropping to an intimate, devastating whisper. "The worst part, Isabel, is not the affair. It's not even this grotesque spectacle." His eyes were locked on hers. "The worst part is that you never once, in 10 years, believed in me. You didn't just doubt my ability to succeed, you doubted my character. You saw my patience as weakness. You saw my integrity as a lack of cunning. You never knew me. You were married to a projection of your own fears and ambitions." He finally opened the manila envelope. He pulled out a single sheaf of papers. "These are divorce papers," he said simply. "My lawyers drew them up yesterday. They are filed under the grounds of adultery and fraud. I will not be contesting your right to a divorce. In fact, I am insisting on it." He then pulled out a second document. "This is an eviction notice. As the legal representative of the company that owns this property, I am giving you and your mother," he nodded toward Eleanor, "24 hours to vacate the premises. You will be allowed to take your personal belongings and nothing else. A security detail will be here in 1 hour to oversee the process." Isabel stared at the papers, her face a crumpled mess of disbelief and horror. "Eviction? Elias, you can't. This is our home." "No," he corrected her gently. "This was my house. It was never our home. A home is built on trust and respect. We haven't had one of those in a very long time." He laid the papers on a small table laden with untouched champagne flutes. His work was done. The truth had been delivered. The consequences had been set in motion. He looked at the faces around him, the shocked guests, the ruined Julian, the horrified Eleanor, the broken Isabel. He felt no triumph, only a vast, aching emptiness, the end of a life. He turned to leave. "Elias, wait!" Isabel cried out, lunging for him, grabbing his arm. "Please, don't do this. I'll do anything. We can go to counseling. I can change. I see that now. I see you." He stopped and looked down at her hand on his arm. He gently, deliberately removed it. He looked into her tear-filled eyes, searching for a flicker of the woman he had married, the woman he had loved with all his heart. He found nothing but a stranger desperate to cling to a life of luxury she had just discovered. "No, Isabel," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with a finality that was more chilling than any anger. "You don't see me. You see the Olympus Project. You see Alistair Finch's respect. You see the money, but you still don't see me, and you never will." He turned and walked away, not looking back. He walked past the stunned guests, past the withering figure of Julian Croft, and back toward the old oak tree at the edge of the property. He did not run. He did not rush. He walked with the steady, measured pace of a man who had just torn down his own life in order to build a new one on a stronger foundation. The sun was beginning to set, casting the whole tragic scene in a warm, golden light, a beautiful end to an ugly day. He left the wreckage behind him and walked toward his future, alone. The 24 hours that followed were a quiet, efficient dismantling. The security team that arrived was professional and discreet. They were employees of VAD, accustomed to handling sensitive corporate matters. They stood by, impassive, as Isabel and Eleanor frantically packed their belongings. The couture gowns, the designer shoes, the jewelry, all of it was stuffed into suitcases. There were arguments, tears, and bitter recriminations between mother and daughter. each blaming the other for their catastrophic fall from grace. Elias did not witness any of it. He had checked into a suite at the Four Seasons, a hotel that would soon be eclipsed by the one in his own Olympus Tower. He sat by the window, looking out at the city skyline he was about to permanently alter. He didn't feel victorious. He felt hollowed out, as if a vital part of him had been surgically removed. He had loved Isabel, or at least the idea of her. He had spent a decade trying to build a life that would make her happy, never realizing that her happiness was a moving target, always just out of reach, always tied to the next acquisition, the next social triumph. His lawyers handled everything. By the end of the next day, the locks on the house were changed. Isabel and Eleanor, their worldly possessions crammed into the back of Eleanor's luxury SUV, had gone to stay with relatives who, upon hearing the news, which was already spreading like wildfire through their social circle, had offered their guest room with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. Julian Croft had disappeared entirely. His office was shuttered, his phones disconnected. The financial house of cards had collapsed in a single gust of wind, leaving behind only debts and broken promises. The divorce was swift and clean. Elias asked for nothing but the dissolution of the marriage. Isabel, on the advice of a hastily hired lawyer who quickly realized the futility of her position, signed the papers without a fight. The woman who had schemed for a life of untold wealth ended up with nothing but her personal effects and a share of a joint savings account that was, by her standards, laughably small. The great irony was that if she had simply waited, if she had shown an ounce of faith, she would have had everything she ever dreamed of, and more. But her dream was never about a shared future. It was about a personal upgrade. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The story of Elias Vance became a quiet legend in the city. The tale of the wedding, the dramatic reveal, the fall of Julian Croft, it was whispered at cocktail parties and business lunches, a modern fable about hubris and hidden strength. Elias himself retreated from the spotlight he had so briefly occupied. He gave one press conference to announce the Olympus Project, where he stood beside Alistair Finch, a figure of calm authority. He spoke of his vision for the building, for the city. He was articulate, passionate, and brilliant. He never once mentioned his personal life. He poured himself into his work. The Olympus Project rose from the ground, a skeleton of steel that grew flesh and skin with each passing month. It was a masterpiece of engineering and art, a testament to his patience and genius. He moved out of the suburban house, selling it and rolling the profits back into his company. He bought a penthouse apartment in a building overlooking the construction site, a minimalist space of glass and stone that was a true reflection of him. It was a sanctuary, not a showcase. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the wedding that wasn't, Elias stood on his balcony, the old Lamy fountain pen in his hand. Below, the Olympus Tower was nearing completion, its magnificent form already a dominant feature of the skyline. It was more beautiful than he had even imagined. His phone buzzed. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. It was a single photo, grainy and taken from a distance. It showed Isabel. She was working as a hostess at a mid-range chain restaurant, the kind of place she and her mother would have once sneered at. She wore a drab uniform. Her hair was pulled back simply. She looked tired, diminished, but she was smiling at a customer, a polite, professional smile. There was no text, just the image. He suspected it was from one of her former friends, a little twist of the knife from the world that had cast her out. He looked at the photo for a long moment. He felt no anger, no satisfaction. The fiery emotions of that day had long since cooled into something else, a quiet, somber wisdom. He had not sought revenge. He had sought truth. The consequences were simply the natural result of a reality being asserted. Isabel's new life was not a punishment he had inflicted. It was the life she had built for herself, stripped of the illusions she had clung to. Perhaps, he thought, For the first time in her life, she was actually building something real. He deleted the photo and put the phone away. He looked back at his tower. He thought about the foundations, buried deep in the earth, invisible to the eye, yet holding up the entire magnificent structure. True worth, he realized, was not in the glittering facade, but in the unseen strength that holds it all together. It was in the integrity of the design, the patience of the builder, the quiet belief in a vision that others could not see. He had lost a wife, but he had found himself. And in the end, he had built something that would last. The story of Elias and Isabel is a dramatic one, but its core lesson is something we can all understand. It teaches us that true value isn't loud or flashy. It's often quiet, patient, and built on a foundation of integrity. It reminds us that underestimating someone based on appearances can be a catastrophic mistake, and that respect is something to be earned through character, not demanded through status. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? Is it about the dangers of arrogance, the power of patience, or the importance of seeing people for who they truly are? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more tales of justice, redemption, and the quiet triumphs of the human spirit. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.